Hi everyone, welcome to Great Girl. Today we are going to dive into the concepts of intensive and extensive properties. So these are quite important to understand to be able to distinguish what exactly is intensive and extensive. So you have come across various properties, let's say color, we have temperature, then we have things like mass, volume, moles. Now, we know these are all classified as properties of a substance. Properties of a substance. Now, this can be further classified into intensive versus extensive. Now, how do we understand? So, when we look at color and temperature, it kind of answers us. A property that could be answered with a question like, what color, what temperature? And this kind of quantifies, talks about how much of something. For example, you could say, how much has the volume changed? How much has moles changed? How much has mass changed? Now, when we talk about things that are changing, we can call them as extensive properties. Now, let's dive a bit more into both intensive and extensive. So intensive, we can think of this as properties that are identical. You can think of them as constant. You can think of them as unchanging. Now, let's further exemplify this. So let's draw a cube. My drawing is really not the best, but yep. So this is, let's say it's just colored. One easy way to actually remember what properties we are talking about is to just think that we are cutting things into half. So let's say this box, we cut this into half. So our color, is it changing? If we cut this into half, we see it's blue, and if we cut, still gonna remain as blue. Temperature. Let's say this is a room temperature. It was at 20 degrees. We measure the inside temperature and then we saw that it's 20 and we cut it into half. What are we going to expect? Is it going to be 20 or is it going to change? It's also going to remain 20. So, both these properties, it did not change. So, it doesn't depend on the amount of substance. So, it doesn't depend if you cut this thing into half, into a quarter, or I don't know. Even if you break this into small pieces, you're still going to same properties, but it's not always the case. So now we would look into extensive properties. Extensive. Now these are things that are changing. So extensive, we could sometimes think extend to some changes. Now what I mean by that. So for example, for this box, we started off with, let's say, 20 kilogram per meter cube. That's the density, and let's just say this is the mass, and let's just say the volume is 5 meter cube. So when we cut this thing, okay, into half, what's our mass going to be? Our mass is going to be 5. Our volume is going to be 2.5. Well, density, it's going to remain the same. Now, to be very frank with you, this density, it actually depends on how you look at it. I would further explain why density can be both intensive and extensive. But for now, this is an intensive property. So we know the formula for density. So we know density is mass over volume. And this, as we have learned before, is an extensive, and this also extensive. However, this ratio is intensive. Now, I will explain to you why sometimes it could be also an extensive property. Okay, now let's have two beakers here. Let's call this water. And water has a density of 1000 kilogram per meter. And here we have oil. Let's say this one has density of 700 kilogram per meter. Now you know that if you, and let's just say there's a certain amount of volume, and so now if you take this into a smaller volume, the density is still going to remain the same. It goes the same for oil. Now let's imagine that we mix these things together. So now what we have is oil plus water. Now, as you have learned, when we have like water, we mix into water, it's not going to change the density. The density is going to remain the same. Same goes for the oil. But now, when we do this, when we mix things together, it's going to have a density that is not intensive anymore, because it's going to be extensive property. Now, why? Because it really depends on, because they are not really going to mix together. So you will have somewhere, let's say, a lot of oil, and then you would have places where we have, we have like little oil. So it's if you like zoom into, like let's say we zoom into here, we zoom into here, we zoom into here, and we are going to see that the density, it's going to be different. We can't have a really good density to measure. So that's when density becomes extensive. So it's quite important to keep that in mind when you try to really understand, like, what am I dealing with? But in general sense, density is most of the time intensive. So now, the key points. It's important to remember intensive. It's always going to be constant, no matter how much you break these things into. No matter how much you break this thing into half, quarter, or you just make it into small stuff, it doesn't matter. It's going to remain the same. So color, just think about color, because it's definitely not going to change. So extensive, it changes with the amount. So when we have a box, as I said, and you cut these things into half, things are going to change for the mass, for the volume. Density, as explained, it can be both extensive and intensive. It really depends on how you look at it. But most of the time, just remember that it's going to be intensive, unless you have something heterogeneous mixture. Heterogeneous is something that is not well mixed. Thank you for watching.